R.C. Sproul once said that if he could only have one book of the Bible with him through the course of his life, the book that he would choose is the book of Hebrews. So I'm really excited to walk through the book of Hebrews with you. In this video, we will talk a little bit about some introductory matters of purpose and authorship and genre. And then we'll do a video on the themes that we find in the book of Hebrews. And then we'll tackle a couple of difficult passages and at least point the way toward some resolution, even if we can't actually resolve the issue. So let's talk a little bit first about the audience. To whom is the book of Hebrews written? Well, it seems to be obvious that it's a Jewish audience. Look at the Jewish elements that are in the book. It talks about priests and sacrifices and tabernacle and blood and angels and Moses and Sabbath and Melchizedek and tabernacle. The author is well versed in the Old Testament covenant. The author is well versed in understanding those issues in the Old Testament that he will soon relate to showing how Christ is a better choice for holding on and drawing near to God than these Old Testament elements, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The audience is also going through persecution for a second time. That's in Hebrews 10, and I'm hoping to take a little bit more of a look at that as well. But in the Roman Empire, there were legal religions and there were illegal religions. And for a time, Christianity received protection from the Roman Empire because they saw it as just another branch of Judaism. But when Jewish people began to rise up and say, "This isn't us," then it left Christians in an exposed way legally. And so they went from being a legal religion to an illegal religion, and that left them exposed to persecution, to arrest, and all of the things that we know happened with the early church. What's interesting about those who this book is being written to about their persecution is it's coming a second time. There's a great description of how they responded to persecution the first time. They did it with great zeal. They joyfully accepted the plundering of their property. They held on. They encouraged each other. They visited each other in prison. And they were so excited to suffer on account of the name of Christ. So they met the first persecution with great zeal. But you can imagine after having all of your stuff plundered and going through all of the arrests and the persecution and the job loss and everything else, suppose that after a while you were able to begin to rebuild your life. You got your job back, you got your house back, you got some semblance of stability, and then persecution rises up again. Do you see how that could be dispiriting? You wouldn't meet the second persecution with the same zeal that you did the first time. This time you would be shaking your head and going, "Oh, not again." So there was, and this letter is an attempt to keep and encourage believers so that they won't draw back. But you can see that this time you might think, you know what, it's a little too much of a cost. If I were to go back to Judaism, I would be going back to a legal religion, and as a result, the persecution against me would end. Do you see how it could be a thought in the minds of people who are going through really difficult times because of the name of Christ? So this letter is pretty important. It's obviously to a Jewish audience. It's people who are dispirited by a second persecution and being called to perseverance. And so the author wants to outline for them. He wants to, in every way, describe perseverance, and one of the ways that he does that is talking about in the future, there are such better and abiding possessions that await. So the author is doing everything in his literary power, and his literary power is considerable, to encourage the audience to stand with Christ, to stand steadfast. So his key word in the book, especially in the beginning parts of the book, is to show that Jesus is better than any number of Old Testament issues. So he compares the elements of the Old Testament covenant to the ministry of Christ. So you'll get a comparison of angels and Moses and sacrifices and tabernacle and all of the rest. And he's trying to make the point that they should not leave behind the person and the benefits of Christ in order to escape the present persecution. The present persecution will not last forever, but the benefits of knowing and loving and holding on firmly to Jesus Christ, that's what is permanent. It is one who is looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. And so this book reminds us of the cost of discipleship, but it also tells us about the joy and the wonder and the satisfaction and the hope that comes to us in Christ. So we have the audience and we have the purpose. Now the question arises, what kind of literature is the book of Hebrews? All right, so I think maybe even your copy in your Bible may say something like the Epistle to the Hebrews. But I have a question about that. In Paul's epistles and in the Epistle of James and in Peter's epistles and Jude, they all seem to follow this general style. Sometimes maybe an element is missing here or there, but generally there's an opening greeting that talks about the author, the recipients. It gives thanksgiving for the relationship between the sender and the people receiving the letter. The body of the letter would include some teaching elements, and then the section of the body would come that gives encouragement. All right, and then there'd be a benediction at the end, greetings among friends. By the way, this person that you know sends greetings to you, and please say hi to this person for me. And you're familiar with all of those because it's the structure of most of the New Testament, at least Paul's writings, Peter's writings, James' writings, Jude's writings, right? So now my question is, you look at the book of Hebrews, and all that we have in common is that benediction, right? Everything else, there's no opening greeting, there's no thanksgiving for the relationship. The body of the letter is strung together with all kinds of different Old Testament illustrations, but it doesn't have that solid teaching core or the solid encouragement core. The two things are almost completely interwoven. So that begs the question then, is this really a letter? And if not, what is it? And for the answer to that, I'm going to take you to William Lane. William Lane has written a great, readable little commentary that's probably out of print, but it would be worth your finding. It's called A Call to Commitment. He also has in the Word commentary series, he has volumes 1 and volume 2 of the book of Hebrews. But in A Call to Commitment, he says that Hebrews is a sermon. It's not a letter. So when we read Hebrews, we are exposing ourselves to early Christian preaching. We should approach Hebrews as we would approach any sermon, with a readiness to hear what a pastor who is sensitive to God and deeply concerned for his people has to say. So that's genre. I think we're looking at a sermon. I think we're looking at what a Jewish sermon, one of those Sunday or one of those Saturday synagogue presentations, would look a lot like the book of Hebrews in the way that they presented the material, in the way that they made the points that they made. All right, so now my question becomes, so who wrote it? We don't have the opening thing that says, Paul to the church at. So who actually wrote this? And most will argue that it's somebody with very high polished Greek, somebody with great rhetorical skill. For that reason, some people say it might be Apollos, some might say Barnabas. And one of the points that they make in argument that it would not be Paul but someone else is that in Galatians 1, Paul argues, now he's got a particular point to make in Galatians chapter 1, but he says, I received the gospel directly from God. And in Hebrews, the author says he received it from others, it's almost as if the person who wrote the book of Hebrews is sort of second generation. So the issue then comes in this Hebrews passage. The question is, who is us? So I don't know that this necessarily precludes Paul, because Paul may be saying we corporately, me, you in the church, we are trusting what we have received from others, which is true, but Paul also has more distinct reception of the gospel on the road to Damascus and in the training that Jesus gave him. So I don't know that that specifically precludes Paul. And we've already said that the book of Hebrews is a different genre. And if that's true, then you don't want to limit a person. If I write a poem, you would not want to also say that means I cannot write a piece of fiction because I'm a poet. See, people can move from genre to genre, and in this case, the genre of the book of Hebrews and the topics and subjects that are included in the book of Hebrews are radically different than the other books that we have. And so I'm wondering if, when you look at the usual style of Paul in a letter like Philippians or in a letter like Colossians, and then you compare it to the eloquent and smooth Greek of the book of Hebrews, is that enough to discount Paul? So you probably already guessed I'm kind of a Paul advocate, but it doesn't really tell us. And so in my descriptions of the book of Hebrews, I will probably just say the author of the book of Hebrews, because we don't know exactly who is. All right, so join me in the next video, which is on the book of Hebrews and its themes. Thanks.